So there were two attacks, in fact. One in December 2012, which was a smaller scale thing, but they took about £5 million. And then this attack in Manhattan was part of a much bigger scale attack that came about 2 months later, where they overall managed to get about $40 million in action. And the attacks were similar in nature, but different in their targets. In the first attack, it was an Indian credit card sort of processor that was their systems were compromised. And that's how they managed to override the limits on these cards. It's only quite a small number. You had 5 cards. It's only quite a small number of accounts that were compromised. It was the way they were managed to manipulate the limits on them that was notable in here. And you can see something about the scale of this attack. So in the first attack, the cashers executed about 4,500 ATM withdrawals to get the money, and they did it 20 countries, took about 5 million out of it. In the second attack, that was actually a US card processor that was attacked. Again, 12 cards, a relatively small number of cards, but you can see they've gone upscale quite significantly here. They've come up to 30,000 ATM transactions in 24 countries in 24 hours. So they, I take my hat off to them. They were quite organised. They were able to get teams of people across the countries, across different countries, send them the information, create the cards, all very coordinated about when they started, go off, hit all the cash points, finish. So it's criminal, but you can't say they weren't organised. So if we look at the US side of it, the gang that worked in New York, there was about 7 people involved in it. As I've said, modest. These people at the edge of this network, their technical kind of ability was relatively modest. They were able to receive some details, make the cards, play the cards. That's relatively straightforward to do. It's the devices and stuff you need for that aren't difficult to get hold of. So the people doing that risky physical side of it, relatively modest in their abilities. But if you like, the people who organised it were quite good, quite impressive in the fact that they could coordinate this across many gangs, across many countries, thousands, tens of thousands of transactions. You could say, what did they do with the money? Well, the people in the US, when they were actually when the police went in and caught them, they only found about $60,000 in cash. They found about $100,000 in some bank accounts that they had, and they found that they'd all gone out and spent the money rather recklessly, buying very expensive watches, the sort of things that I wouldn't advise criminals, but the things to do if you're a criminal and you acquire some money is not to start doing conspicuous things with it. So that's an example of some crime, and I say that to give you a feel for the timing of it, the way that it can happen quite quickly, the way that it can be geographically dispersed across in this case, many different countries. Some idea of the numbers of people that can be involved and the speed with which it can happen. That's an example. If I say more generally about crime, I've said it's an adversarial thing. So there's definitely it's not a passive environment that you're working in. A lot of it is about there's definitely a victim, an attacker, and they both have some measure of awareness. And it's this asymmetry between the criminal keeping ahead of the law, the criminal keeping ahead their awareness of the situation, being ahead of the victim, the people they're preying on. For financial types of crimes, the main types of crime that I've been had some visibility of tend to be to do with fraud, which is about obtaining goods and services by deception. That's a bit indirect. I mean, criminals are always interested in money. Where they go after goods and services, the services are things like airtime and things they can sell on. All the goods tend to be mobile phones, iPods, small expensive types of devices. A lot of high-tech stuff that's bought by criminals using stolen credit cards or stolen prepaid cards ends up being shipped to let's think. A lot of it ends up being shipped to warehouses close to Russia, fortunately, because people won't ship things to Russia, so it gets shipped to warehouses and addresses close to Russia, and it kind of goes across the border, and then it's sold on or sold back. So there's a big scale of industry about monetarising information which required credit card numbers or financial details. There's a big effort to turn it into money. And obviously in financial systems, there's always, there are checks and balances within the systems about money moving into accounts and moving around accounts, but there's always a lot of attention paid to money coming out of the system. So when money comes out of ATMs and things like that, that's usually the sort of thing that's attended to very closely. So a way around that is often to spend it to buy things and sell those on. So fraud is one of the biggest types of crime we see. The other is money laundering. You might think money laundering is a very much to do with serious organised crime and mafia and kind of niche kind of thing. But it turns out the definitions of money laundering are really any sort of activities that involve handling the proceeds of crime. So it doesn't have to be a great grand scheme that involves money for extortion and prostitution and things like that being put through businesses. Even quite modest sort of crime that leads to money that people then handle gets classed under money laundering. And there are checks and